Hey, you guys, we're going to read Chapter 4 in the book Runt. Okay. It's time, King called to the hunters. The pack circled around the black wolf. Silver and Biter and the 2 yearlings sniffed his face, touched his muzzle, raised their voices in reply. It's time, they echoed. King tipped his head back and began a howl. The other adults and the yearlings joined in. They sang, their voices lifting and falling, twining around one another and separating again until 5 wolves sounded like 10, 20. The pups hadn't learned how to howl, but they joined the song as they could. They bunched their faces together, lifted their small muzzles to the sky, and yipped and ki-yied fervently. It's time, King said again, and he moved out toward the surrounding forest in an easy lope. Helper stayed behind as usual. Since the pups had arrived, his job in the pack was to babysit, but the rest of the hunters fell in behind their leader single file. Silver, Biter, Hunter, each one stepped in the footprints of the one before, so the tracks they left were nearly those of one wolf. Their big paws splayed as they touched the earth and curled as they lifted. Their entire bodies whipped forward in an easy bouncing rhythm. They could keep such a pace about 5 miles per hour for a half a day without ever pausing. Once the hunters had moved out, Helper picked a stick up in his mouth, held it up in a teasing way, and then ran to the middle of the clearing. All the pups except Runt tumbled after him. Runt remained where he was, gazing after the departing hunters. To be able to hunt was a gift. It was perhaps the most important gift of all. If he was going to learn to be a good hunter, he needed to begin. And without a glance towards Helper and his littermates, Runt set off after the other hunters. The black pup followed along the edge of the lake. He followed into the hushed pines, and even when he could no longer glimpse the tip of Hunter's tail ahead, just disappearing among the trees, he continued to follow, nose down, pursuing his family's warm and familiar scent. The first time he stopped or even hesitated was when a grosbeak called down to him from a tall pine. "You must be King's son," he said. "You look just like him." "You're small, though, very small." "I'm part of the hunt," Runt replied, deciding to ignore the rude remark about his size. He studied the bird's smoky red head and breast. "I beg to differ," the grosbeak replied. "You aren't part of the hunt at all. The hunters are far ahead." "Where have they?" Runt started to say, but the bird had already spread his wings and risen into an undulating flight. Runt gave his shoulder a lick to wash away the insult of the bird's sudden departure. That means the bird pooped on him. He didn't need anyone to tell him how to locate his family anyway. He put his nose to the pine duff again and set off once more on their trail. The scent was growing fainter, and as the force that pulled him along grew less strong, Runt began making various stops and detours. First, he paused to listen to a chorus of peepers. Then he zigzagged after a swallowtail butterfly. A stream, dashing along at its own busy pace, called him for a long drink. Runt sat back on his haunches, his muzzle dripping. Had the hunters crossed here? He found no trace of their scent. Maybe it would take up again on the other side. But when Runt splashed across the other bank, he couldn't find his pack smell there either. He kept moving nonetheless. He had come too far to consider turning back. Runt trotted, then plodded, then trotted again, though he followed nothing now. No disappearing tail, no diminishing scent. He kept going and going until he had finally no choice but to stop and admit to himself and the watching forest that he was well and truly lost. An enormous pileated woodpecker hammered at a nearby tree. The noise was an assault echoing through the woods. Runt sat listening, but even when the hammering stopped, he didn't attempt to ask for directions. Woodpeckers tended to be crabby fellows. Maybe it was all that pounding. A striped chipmunk scurried past. Runt laid a swift paw on his back, holding him fast. "Do you know where the hunters went?" he asked. "I know where my family is," Chipmunk chitted nervously. "Nothing more." "You're much smaller than I am," he announced finally. "So what?" Chipmunk squeaked, rather boldly, Runt thought, for one being held down by the weight of a paw. "Now let me go. I have to carry these seeds to my family." Obediently, Runt lifted his paw and let the fellow scurry away. What difference did it make that the chipmunk was small? He carried seeds to his family. Weasel emerged from beneath a tree stump. "Have you seen the hunters?" Runt called, but the sleek brown fellow disappeared into a thicket of Juneberries without even bothering to answer. Runt was beginning to realize that following the hunters might have been a rather serious mistake. If he had stayed home, he would be napping in a comfortable pile with his littermates now, or bouncing on Patient Helper's tail, or simply waiting for the hunters to return with meat. He sat down in the middle of a patch of jack-in-the-pulpits and looked around. The forest was familiar, but entirely strange at the same time. He was clearly far from home, and he no longer had any idea which way to turn to get back. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He tipped his head back, drew his lips into a tight O, and began to yip and cry like any other lost pup. But after the first few yips, something unexpected happened. A howl rose on the sweet summer air. The sound startled Runt. Had it come from his own mouth? He stopped, then lifted his head and tried to yip again. Another long howl, as lost and lonely sounding as he felt, floated towards the arching sky and the green branches. He liked the sound, so this time he didn't stop. He just howled and howled. "What do you want?" The voice was deep, filled with authority. Runt looked down. A pair of large paws stood before him. Slender legs, silver fur. "Mother!" he cried. But the stern gray face towering over him was not his mother's. It was not, in fact, the face of any wolf he had seen before. "Why are you in my territory?" the wolf demanded. Runt wanted to answer, but no further sound would come from his mouth. It was as though the remains of his voice had sailed away on the word mother. He could do nothing, in fact, before this stranger but tuck his tail, lower his body to the ground, and tremble. "Why are you here?" the wolf repeated. "I am king of this place, and you are not part of my pack." Please," Runt stammered. I'm looking for my family." He didn't dare look again into the face of the great wolf standing over him. "Are they here?" the gray wolf king demanded. "To know." The wolf along his spine, "Are they here?" the gray king demanded to know, the fur along his spine rising to attention. "No," Runt admitted. "I'm the only one, and I seem to be lost just a bit." "Just a bit?" the wolf repeated, and Runt detected something in his voice that was almost a smile. That's like when you hear me say, "Do you think?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the gray king said, "Follow me." Just that, and he turned and walked away. Runt followed meekly. He had no idea where he was being taken. But he kept close behind the Gray King, clambering over fallen trees, circling boulders, slogging through marshy patches that the other wolves stepped over, around, or through without even seeming to notice. When they reached the stream Runt had crossed earlier, the king stopped and sniffed a rock standing at the edge of the water. And then he lifted his leg and left a message. That means he peed on it. "This is my territory," the message said. "If you are a wolf, stay away." "I thank you," Runt murmured, stepping into the stream. I'm sure my father thanks you too." The wolf didn't answer, only stood watching Runt cross back to his family's territory. There was, though, something in his intense gaze that reminded Runt very much of another king entirely, one who wore a black coat and carried a white star on his chest. "I will forgive your trespass," the golden eyes said, "but only because you are young and foolish and small, much too small." Runt ducked his head and headed away from the stream and the watching Gray King, though he still had no idea how he was going to find his family or how he was going to find his way back to the den, for that matter. And that is the end of chapter 4.